Nolan Wells' phone was recovered after his disappearance, but weeks later, the device at the center of the mystery still had not undergone the forensic examination investigators and his family had agreed to. And that leaves one enormous question hanging over this case. What could be sitting inside that phone? Because Nolan was found dead 2 days after disappearing from a 4th of July gathering on Horn Island, and his family says the phone could help establish what he was doing, who he communicated with, and what happened during his final hours. But there is something even more complicated. The family says they agreed with prosecutors on a joint forensic examination involving both sides' experts, potentially including the FBI. So why hadn't that examination happened? And why did the dispute suddenly turn into a public fight over whether Nolan's family was cooperating with investigators? This case stands apart because one small device could potentially help reconstruct the final hours of an 18-year-old whose cause and manner of death remain officially unresolved. Before we dive into the case, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who follows true crime cases where the evidence doesn't always tell the whole story. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love seeing where everyone is joining from. Now, let's go back to the 4th of July, 2026. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He was a student athlete from Mississippi who played football and had his future ahead of him. On July 4th, Nolan traveled with friends by boat to Horn Island, a barrier island off Mississippi's Gulf Coast, to celebrate Independence Day. There were boats everywhere. People were partying, and at some point that afternoon, Nolan disappeared. His friends eventually returned to the mainland without him, saying he had chosen to remain on the island after meeting a girl and believed he could get another ride back. But his family has questioned that explanation from the beginning, because Nolan apparently didn't have his phone or his keys with him when he disappeared. And that phone would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. But here's the first detail to remember. The phone wasn't found with Nolan. It was later recovered from one of the friends who had been on the trip. That immediately raised questions for Nolan's parents. Why was his phone with someone else? And what happened to it between the moment Nolan disappeared and the moment his family got it back? Those questions became even more important when the family said they noticed what appeared to be missing or erased content from the device. But before we get to that, we need to go back to the beginning, because the phone only matters if we understand the timeline it could potentially help reconstruct. Nolan arrived at Horn Island with his friends on July 4. According to the accounts that have been publicly reported, the group spent hours at the island's holiday gathering. Then the situation changed. The boat began experiencing problems, including a reported issue involving its bilge pump. An emergency call was made from the boat, and the group eventually prepared to leave. But Nolan wasn't with them. His friends have said Nolan wanted to stay behind because he had met a girl at the party. According to their account, Nolan believed he had another way to get back. That explanation has become one of the central disputed points in the case. Because Nolan's family says the decision was out of character, they have questioned why he would voluntarily remain on a remote island without his phone or keys while his friends were leaving. And that's where the phone becomes more than just a missing object. It could potentially provide a digital timeline. Who had Nolan contacted? Who had contacted him? Were there messages before the group arrived? Were there messages during the party? Was anyone communicating with Nolan after his friends left? And perhaps most importantly, was anything deleted? Those questions are not proof that anyone harmed Nolan. They are simply questions investigators could potentially answer through a proper forensic extraction. But the phone wasn't immediately analyzed. Instead, weeks passed. Then, on July 15, Nolan's family and the Jackson County District Attorney's Office reportedly agreed to a joint forensic examination of the device. The proposed examination was supposed to involve the Digital Forensics Lab at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College, with possible FBI participation. The idea was straightforward. Examine the phone together, with experts from both sides present, so there would be no dispute over what was extracted or how the evidence was handled. At that point, it seemed like the phone mystery might finally be resolved, but it wasn't. According to the family's legal team, no date or time was ever established for the examination. Then, almost a month later, the dispute escalated. On August 12, the DA's office reportedly sent the family a letter directing them to deliver the phone by 9 a.m. on August 14. The family's attorneys objected to that process. They said Nolan's parents were outside Mississippi, and that the two sides had never finalized the forensic protocol, including chain of custody, preservation of the extraction, access to the resulting data, and what would happen to the device afterward. The family insisted they weren't refusing to cooperate. They said they wanted the examination to happen, but under the terms they believed had already been agreed upon. And then the story became even more complicated. Public accusations began circulating that Nolan's family was somehow preventing investigators from examining the phone. His attorneys pushed back strongly. They said the family remained willing to hand over the phone for a joint forensic examination and wanted both sides' experts involved. By August 17, the family said its forensic experts were on standby and asked the DA's office to choose a date between August 18 and August 21 for the examination. But as of the latest reporting, there was still no publicly confirmed forensic examination of Nolan's phone. And while this dispute was unfolding, something else happened that dramatically raised the stakes around the entire investigation. The NAACP announced that its Office of General Counsel was joining the legal effort surrounding Nolan's death. The organization said it wanted to push for truth, transparency, and accountability while the circumstances surrounding Nolan's death remained insufficiently explained. Then members of the Congressional Black Caucus called for federal scrutiny of the case. Suddenly, what had started as a local investigation into the death of an 18-year-old on Horn Island had become a nationally watched case, and the phone was still sitting there, unexamined. But there was one more reason the device mattered. Nolan's independent autopsy did not give his family the definitive answer they wanted. The pathologist classified both the cause and manner of death as undetermined pending further investigation. The examination found no fractures or deep tissue injuries, but it also documented a red discoloration on the back of Nolan's skull that was considered inconclusive and warranted further investigation. So now, investigators were dealing with several unanswered questions at once. What exactly happened to Nolan after he separated from his friends? How did he end up in the water? Why was his phone with someone else? Was anything deleted from it? And what could the phone tell investigators about Nolan's final movements? Those questions remain unanswered. But the next development would make the dispute over the phone even more significant. The phone was supposed to be the next major step. Instead, it became another unresolved piece of the investigation. The family had asked for a joint forensic examination. Their attorneys said their experts were ready. And on August 17th, they asked the district attorney's office to choose a date between August 18th and August 21st, so the examination could finally happen. But as of the latest reporting, there was still no publicly confirmed examination of Nolan's phone. And that is important because the phone isn't just another piece of personal property. According to Nolan's family's attorney, his mother used Life 360 to track the phone after Nolan disappeared. The device was eventually located at the home of one of the people who had been with Nolan on the boat. When the family retrieved it, they said they found messages had been deleted. That claim has never been established publicly as proof that someone deleted evidence related to Nolan's death. But it creates a very specific question. What was on that phone before those messages disappeared? The family later went further, seeking records from technology and social media companies, including meta platforms, Snapchat, TikTok, and Life 360. Those subpoenas were intended to obtain information about Nolan's accounts and digital activity, so investigators potentially have several different sources of digital evidence: the physical phone, cloud or platform records, location data, social media activity, and the timeline generated by the boat's GPS. If those sources can be compared, they could potentially answer questions that eyewitnesses cannot. For example, if Nolan's phone showed activity at a certain time, investigators could compare that with where the boat was. If Life 360 showed a location inconsistent with someone's account, investigators could investigate the discrepancy. If messages were sent or received shortly before Nolan disappeared, those communications could potentially identify people who were in contact with him. And if deleted material could be recovered through forensic analysis, investigators could determine whether it was significant or simply ordinary phone activity. But there is an important distinction here. None of this proves that Nolan was murdered. It doesn't prove that someone deleted evidence. And it doesn't prove that his friends lied. Those are possibilities being questioned by Nolan's family, not established facts. The district attorney has also pushed back against the growing public pressure surrounding the investigation. On August 18th, Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath released a statement explaining that prosecutors cannot publicly discuss certain investigative details, including evidence and witnesses, while the investigation is active. She also said her office intends to present a thorough case to the grand jury. That creates a frustrating situation for people following the case. Nolan's family is speaking publicly because they believe there are unanswered questions. The DA's office is saying it cannot publicly answer many of those questions without potentially compromising the investigation. And sitting between those two positions is Nolan's phone, a device that could contain information, but information that, according to the latest public reporting, still hasn't been fully examined. And then another development emerged that made the drowning theory worth examining more closely. Newly obtained data reportedly showed that there had been no recorded drownings at Horn Island during the previous 6 years. That does not mean drowning was impossible. It doesn't mean Nolan couldn't have drowned, and it certainly doesn't prove foul play. But it provides another piece of context for investigators trying to determine exactly what happened to him. Horn Island is surrounded by water, and conditions can be dangerous. But the question investigators have to answer isn't simply whether someone could drown there. The question is whether the physical evidence, the medical evidence, the timeline, and Nolan's final movements are consistent with that explanation. And right now, the public doesn't have all of that information. The independent autopsy ordered by Nolan's family was unable to determine a definitive cause or manner of death. The official autopsy has also not been publicly released. Authorities have said the case remains under investigation, with a grand jury review planned. So, the phone could become particularly important because it may help investigators reconstruct what happened before Nolan entered the water. But there is another piece of evidence that may be even more important: the timeline. According to publicly reported GPS data, the boat arrived at Horn Island around late morning on July 4th and remained there for several hours. Then the boat left the island, without Nolan. His friends say he intentionally stayed behind. His family questions that explanation. And somewhere inside that gap is the answer to one of the most important questions in the entire case. When was Nolan last definitely seen alive? And what happened between that moment and the boat leaving the island? Because if investigators can establish that timeline, the phone becomes a tool for testing the story, not for creating a theory, for testing it. If the digital evidence supports the friend's account, that matters. If it contradicts the account, that matters too. And if the phone contains no useful information, that matters as well. But until the examination actually happens, the public doesn't know which of those scenarios we're dealing with. And that's why the latest development isn't simply that Nolan's phone hasn't been examined. It's that the phone has become a battleground over how the investigation itself should be conducted. Nolan's family wants a joint examination with their experts present. The district attorney's office has its own investigative responsibilities. Both sides say they want answers, but they have not publicly demonstrated that they agree on how to get there. Meanwhile, the case has grown far beyond the original search for an 18-year-old who failed to return from a holiday trip. The NAACP has now joined the family's legal effort. Members of Congress have called for federal scrutiny. Nolan's family continues to challenge the idea that he simply chose to remain on the island. His friends continue to maintain that he stayed behind voluntarily, and prosecutors say the public needs to allow the investigation and grand jury process to proceed. So where does that leave the case? Right now, Nolan Wells' death remains an ongoing investigation. There has been no public murder charge against anyone in connection with his death. The independent autopsy did not establish a definitive cause or manner of death. The official findings have not been publicly released, and the forensic examination of Nolan's phone has not been publicly confirmed. But the phone remains potentially important because it could help answer questions that have followed this case from the beginning. Who was Nolan communicating with? Where was his phone during the critical hours? What happened to the messages that the family says were deleted? And can the digital evidence be reconciled with the accounts given by the people who were with him? Those questions may eventually have answers. But for now, they're still questions. And perhaps that's the most important thing to remember about Nolan Wells' case. A viral video doesn't prove an altercation involving Nolan. A lack of recorded drownings doesn't prove he didn't drown. A disputed timeline doesn't automatically prove someone committed a crime. And a phone containing deleted messages doesn't automatically mean those messages were evidence of wrongdoing. What the investigation needs is evidence that can survive scrutiny. Because Nolan's family isn't simply asking for another theory, they're asking to know what happened to their son. And until the phone is examined, the medical evidence is fully understood, and the timeline is resolved, One potentially important piece of that answer remains locked inside a device that still hasn't been fully analyzed. If you have information about Nolan's final hours or were present on Horn Island on July 4th, investigators are asking witnesses to come forward. And if you've been following this case, subscribe to the channel for future updates. Like this video if you want to see more carefully researched true crime coverage, and share it so more people can follow Nolan's case. And before you go, tell me in the comments, do you think Nolan's phone could finally help clarify what happened during those missing hours? Whatever your theory is, remember that Nolan was an 18-year-old whose family is still waiting for answers. Because until the evidence tells us otherwise, the most important question isn't what makes the best theory. It's simply this: what happened to Nolan Wells during those final hours, and will the evidence finally give his family an answer?